Hey everybody, I'm Zoe.
And I'm Chandi.
And this is Bound by the Cloak. Chandi, if I ask you what a furry is, or what comes to mind when you hear the word furry, what do you think of?
I'm thinking of a big hall, like a convention hall, where you see lots of people in like animal suits, and they're all just kind of having fun and high-fiving people.
Yeah, I guess I don't think of conventions necessarily. That wasn't the first thing for me. But I think of people dressed as animals, but like really creative, colorful suits. And like, obviously, like they're called furries. I'm assuming there's a lot of fur involved. And I guess I usually think of like cats, dogs, wolves. Particular animals come to mind. It reminds me of like going to an amusement park and you kind of see somebody dressed as a character from like Disney or Looney Tunes or whatever it is. That's kind of what pops in my head first.
Yeah, and for some reason, neon. I see a lot of neon.
So when you hear the word furry, what comes to mind? Is it costumes, conventions, internet memes? The furry fandom is one of the most misunderstood and at times misrepresented subcultures out there. But beneath the stereotypes lies a vibrant, creative, and deeply connected community built around self-expression.
This week, we're pulling back the curtain on the furry fandom with Dr. Courtney Plante, a psychologist and researcher who spent years studying this unique and often misunderstood subculture. Whether you're a curious outsider, a longtime fan, or just someone who wants to understand what all the buzz is about, we've got you covered. Plus, stick around because we've got a couple of intriguing stories that might just surprise you.
Yeah, welcome to Bound by the Cloak. Today we're joined by Dr. Courtney Plante. Welcome to the show.
Pleasure to be here.
Just to kick things off, can you introduce yourself, tell us who you are, a little bit about your background and what you do?
Sure. I'm Dr. Courtney Plante. The doctor is not a medical doctor, but a doctor of social psychology. So I'm a social psychologist, not a sit on the couch and tell me your problems kind of clinical psychologist, but like put people in boxes and poke them with sticks to see what they do, researcher kind of psychologist. And my areas of expertise are media effects and fantasy and fan culture, which I guess that last part is probably the reason why you got me on here today. I study fan groups, anime fans, My Little Pony fans, furries. Yeah, so a bunch of different fan groups and what drives them. I'm a professor at Bishop's University in Sherbrooke, Quebec, Canada.
And for those who are not familiar, can you tell us what the furry fandom is and what it means to be a furry?
For people who don't know what a furry is, I like to sort of find a touch point. So I say, hey, furries are fans like anyone else, right? So science fiction fans are fans of science fiction. Harry Potter fans are fans of Harry Potter. Furries are just fans. And the things they're a fan of is media featuring what are called anthropomorphized animal characters, just animals that walk and talk and do human things. So think Bugs Bunny, Mickey Mouse, Daffy Duck, that sort of thing. Most people grew up with that sort of media. Most of you can probably think of some kind of animal that walks, talks, and does human things in some piece of media. BoJack Horseman was a really popular show a few years ago that featured walking, talking animal characters. Utopia, I think your Disney's. So furries are just fans of that kind of media. That's the genre that they're a fan of. If it's got a walking animal that does human things, furries will probably like it.
What is it that furries do? What kinds of activities does the community take part in and get involved in?
Yeah, so when people imagine furries, like if you get to close your eyes and picture what a person who's a fan of walking, talking animals does, it's kind of hard to imagine, right? Like, okay, well, I can imagine like Harry Potter fans read Harry Potter and science fiction fans like watch Star Trek and stuff. So what do furries do? Well, they do a lot of the same things that other fans do. So they watch shows, movies, video games, read books featuring these characters, but they do a lot of the other fan behaviors as well. So if you imagine what do science fiction fans do or what do football fans do? Science fiction fans go to conventions. Furries go to conventions to hang out with other furries doing furry stuff. Sports fans go to sporting events in the same way that fans go to conventions. They create content. So a lot of fans of science fiction will create their own fan-created artwork or spin-off stories, or they'll make anime fans will make music videos with their favorite songs mashed up with their favorite characters from series and stuff. Furries do that sort of thing as well. Anime fans cosplay, so they'll dress up as their favorite characters. Furries will essentially do that with fursuiting. So one of the most visually iconic parts of being a furry is the fursuit, the full body mascot style fuzzy costume. And furries will do that. So instead of dressing up like a Klingon or a Jedi, they'll dress up as a walking, talking cat. So it's a lot of the same things that you see in other fan behaviors. If you're a fan of anything, intuitively you can understand most of the things that furries do.
Let's just talk about your academic journey and the furry fandom. So how did that start? What made you want to study fandoms, fan cultures, and especially furries?
Yeah, so when you get to graduate school, they tell you, okay, you have to study something, right? You have to spend the next 5 years of your life studying something, working on a dissertation. And there were a lot of topics that were kind of boring to me. And I'm like, well, if I'm going to do this for the next 5 years, I'm going to do something that I'm interested in. And so at the time, I was playing a lot of video games, and I was going to furry hangouts. So a bunch of my friends were furries, and I was starting to get into it, or at least be curious about it. So I'm like, well, okay, since this is what I'm doing in my spare time, turn my hobby into my job. So I did a lot of video game research, and I did a lot of research on furry culture. And so it was kind of a neat way to combine my hobby with my job. And as it turns out, there weren't a lot of people studying it at the time. And the best way to become the world's expert on something is to just do something literally no one else is doing. And so, or at least I thought at the time that no one else was doing. Turns out there were a couple of other people. But so that's sort of how I fell into it, was just trying to justify my weird hobbies. And then as time went on, I started to realize that there was a lot of low-hanging fruit and untapped potential for research here. You know, you look at something like Furry or My Little Pony fans or bronies or anime fans, and at first glance you're like, these are weird people. What value do you get out of studying it? And one of the things we've learned very quickly is that it allows us to test the applicability of psychological theories to really out there context. Like if I can show that some psychological principle that works well for Joe Everyman also applies to this really bonkers sort of group of people, it's a pretty robust theory. But also allows us to test really interesting hypotheses about the utility of fan culture. Like what it's functional. There's a reason we do this. There's a reason why so many people are drawn to fan interest specifically. And that's a lot of the things that I test, right? And I say, hey, if I can find that hanging out with other friends while watching My Little Pony or watching Zootopia or watching anime, if you can get benefits from those social communities, despite the fact that they're kind of weird and out there, then you should also get similar benefits from the sports fans you hang out with or the One Direction fans you hang out with. So yeah, finding that a lot of these groups, despite their superficial differences, have a lot of underlying psychological processes that are similar is really interesting and shows that, hey, we have a lot more in common than differences, despite some of the aesthetic preferences of our hobbies.
What makes someone want to be a furry, and how do they really get into this? Where does it usually start?
Yeah, that's a question I get a lot, is why furry? Why not a normal thing like sports? Or like, what's the Taylor Swift? Like a normal thing, right? And I mean, it comes down to aesthetic preference, really. Like, why do some people like chocolate, some people like vanilla, and some weirdos like cilantro? Why do people like the things that they like? And I think it's a combination of things. There's like a million different ways you could answer this question. The big, broad, philosophical answer is, well, humans, for as long as time immemorial, have been fascinated with animals. Animals are the only other thing on this planet or in this universe that we know of that have something in common with us, right? Amidst the universe of dead rocks and not much else, these things are organic. They respond. They have interests of their own. And so humans sort of understand their place in the universe by looking to animals and trying to understand animals. And so I think, from the early cave paintings, humans were fascinated with this idea of what do we have in common with animals? And so it's a really primitive human instinct to be curious about animals and to understand ourselves with respect to animals, or to anthropomorphize animals. Anyone who's ever talked to their pet cat or dog has understood that, okay, obviously my cat can't understand the words that are coming out of my mouth, but I still feel this connection. Like at some level, maybe I understand my cat. So humans naturally are drawn to this idea of the boundary between human and animals. In a more sort of modern sense, why furry? I think people just have hobbies. I mean, the average person in North America has probably grown up watching Mickey Mouse and Bugs Bunny, right? We grew up watching these as cartoons. Most of us had toys that reflected this, playing with a barrel of monkeys, or God, I'm dating myself. That's an old toy. But grew up watching My Little Pony, and then you buy all the little play sets and toys and stuff. And so you're surrounded by this as a kid. And a lot of people have a fondness for it, right? We do this for other things, comic books. You grow up with comic books, and so you're an adult now, and you still have a certain fondness or a soft spot for the comic books of your youth. And so I think for a lot of furries, they develop this aesthetic interest in anthropomorphism at a young age. And then as an adult, they just sort of don't lose it. A lot of people grow out of that interest, and some folks don't. Some folks just like, it never quite grew out of it. It's still compelling to me. So I think that's sort of two answers to the why furry thing in terms of how people get into it. It used to be the case back in the 90s and I guess the early 2000s that it was usually by accident. The early furry fandom was one of those things where if you didn't know someone who was in it, or you didn't know explicitly what you were looking for, it was really easy to miss it, right? So there were small little conventions that sort of spread by word of mouth, or there were sort of very niche websites where if you didn't know that there was this forum here, you could easily miss it. So a lot of folks would have this sort of interest, like, oh, I'm a 21-year-old who has this interest in drawing these characters, and I feel like a weirdo because I don't know anyone else who's doing it. Nowadays, with social media, it is a lot easier to just kind of discover your community very easily. So a lot of folks nowadays will say things like, oh, TikTok. I went on TikTok and saw a bunch of folks dressing up in animal costumes, or I saw a bunch of really cool art that I liked. And so it's much more likely today that people were inspired by seeing the community through some kind of social media, and they say, and it's really easy now to press the follow button or to jump into a conversation. Again, 25 years ago, you had to kind of get an invite or get pulled in by someone, dragged along to a convention, or have something put into your hand, like a magazine put into your hand. So it's a little easier today than it perhaps was to get into it. I think it's why you see that there's a tremendous growth in the fandom relative to, say, 20 years ago.
Seems like in the past it was more underground, and now it's out and about with conventions being more public.
Yeah, there's a really interesting dynamic in the furry fandom regarding this sort of underground origins. Because like from very early on in the fandom, it had kind of I don't want to say like a punk aesthetic, but more like a counterculture feel to it, right? Sort of like a lot of science fiction fans would kind of embrace the weird, right? So you go to a science fiction convention and like, yeah, I'm wearing my alien costume. What are you going to do about it? Mundane. Like, it's kind of like embracing the wackiness and weirdness and just really leaning into it. And I think a lot of early furry was very much that sort of vibe, that do-it-yourself counterculture kind of vibe. And there is a really interesting, as the fandom grows faster and faster and more people are kind of flooding into it, conventions getting larger, furry websites or art websites and stuff are growing faster. There is some concern, kind of an identity crisis in the furry fandom of, are we becoming mainstream? Is this something we want? Or do you lose something when the fandom grows that quickly? And so there's this interesting discussion about whether or not furry should maintain its sort of counterculture roots and keep furry weird and keep up with this sort of counterculture. We don't want anyone to like us or respect us versus hey, this is a hobby that everyone can get into, right? Let's not gatekeep. One of the nice things about furry is that it's really hard to define and put a box around. It is so many things to so many different people. And yeah, it sort of has its origins in so many different points of entry, so many different people arriving at this space.
Would you say like that's the difference between maybe older furries, the mindset, older furries versus younger furries?
Yeah, a lot of older furries, I think, for them, it has its origins in like this early science fiction fandom. And again, very niche, very sort of like, as an analogy for a second here, to tangent for a second, I can remember growing up being a Lord of the Rings fan. Before it was cool, before the Peter Jackson film, when you got your ass kicked for liking and reading Lord of the Rings in your spare time, right? And so part of me, I was like part of this, this little community of other Tolkien nerds who read these stories. And then suddenly the movies come out and everyone comes rushing in, oh, I'm a total, Lord of the Rings fan. And it's like, whoa, hold on a second. Like, it's almost like a hip, like, I liked it before it was cool. I'm one of the OGs. Ditto for things like Marvel. I can't imagine, because I'm not a huge comic book fan, but I can't imagine being like one of the 1980s or 1970s Marvel fans. Again, when it was really niche, when it was very, you got beat up and you took your lumps for being a fan of this. And nowadays everyone's like, oh, I'm a huge Iron Man fan. I'm like, you watch the films. So I imagine that like with any fandom, there is that sort of generational difference in the people who were kind of here from the beginning and when it was definitely not cool. And as we find furry becoming more and more mainstream, it's starting to get a little more acceptance than it did, say, 30 years ago. And so it's easier than ever to get into it. And yeah, there's going to be a little bit of identity crisis in the fandom as it tries to cope with the fact that it simultaneously wants to be kind of counterculture and punk, but also everyone can be here, right? Come as you will. There's no judgment or stigma, which is a really important part of the fandom, is the non-judgmental acceptance of people as they are.
You're right. I mean, that happens in other communities too. It's like the metal community for sure has been like that, right? Counterculture. And then, once like, let's say Metallica is like the one that everybody knows. It's like, you listen to the earlier albums, you're like, those are amazing. And then they start making music that's a little more mainstream. Everybody is like, oh, of course I like everybody likes Metallica now. And you're like, but do you know every album? Do you know the earlier albums? What do you know about the band?
And there's that tension because you don't want to gatekeep new fans, but you also don't want to lose the thing that made it great originally.
Exactly. I mean, that even happens. I'm a very big horror fan, so that happens somewhat too.
Well, what's great about this, not about that happening, what's great about this is that, like I was saying at the very beginning, if you're a fan of one thing, you intuitively understand furries. That's one of the wonderful things about the research that I've been doing is I study all these different fan groups. And despite superficially looking so different, the underlying psychology is so very similar, right? A music fan can understand when I'm talking about this clash in the furry fandom or this generational divide, and sports fans. I've been a lifelong fan of the Edmonton Oilers versus they're only bandwagon fans. They're only in now because they're in the playoffs, right? My Canadian is showing because I'm making a hockey analogy here, but
the different types of fandoms that you kind of explore, which is interesting to see how diverse they are. But speaking of identity and individual identity, what is a fursona?
One of the things that is sort of distinct about the furry fandom, I don't want to say unique, but kind of distinct, is the creation of a fursona. So furries love their puns. So fursona, furry, and persona. But it's like a kind of like an avatar or a representation of you in furry spaces. So in the same way that if you're a gamer, right, you're a big gamer online, you play Black Ops online, you don't use your name. You're not John Smith to everyone else, right? You come up with a handle or a YouTube or a name. Or if you're on YouTube, right, if you're big in YouTube community or Twitch, you have a handle. You don't usually just like use your first and last name. And so it's sort of like that plus some other stuff. So in the furry fandom, you don't just go around using your name, you have a handle. But in addition to just kind of a name, there's also an avatar, a character to go with it, right? So the idea is, well, hey, if you were in this furry space where, anthropomorphized animals are kind of why not represent yourself with an anthropomorphized animal? So, hey, you could be yourself, or you could be a cat version of yourself who's your favorite color and, is 250 pounds and all roided up, if that's your jam, right? So, yeah, so a lot of furries, when they come into the fandom, they'll go to a meetup or a convention, and they'll see that a lot of furs will wear literal badges that say, oh, here's my character, here's a picture of them, here's their name, and like, oh, I should get one of those too. So more than 95% of furries have a fursona, this little representation of themselves. One of the first things you do when you get into the fandom. And it's just kind of like this is my identity within furry space. This is what you can call me. And what's really cool is that a lot of fursonas are aspirational. They're idealized versions of themselves. It's here's what I could be if I could be anything, right? Like if you could go back to a blank drawing board and create yourself, what would you be? Like, okay, so my fursona is like me, but like a funnier, smarter, faster, better looking, more witty version of myself. And also they're a half a foot taller and everyone loves them. So you create fursonas that are better versions of yourself. So there's this interesting dynamic where fursona is both who you are, but also you sanded off the rough part. So a lot of furries say, my fursona is me. Like it's, if I wear glasses, my fursona might also wear glasses. So it's not like an entirely different character, but it's usually me plus some other stuff. We find if you're, for a lot of trans furries, this is really helpful to them. They're, in the process of transitioning, or if they're even just kind of curious about like trying on a different gender identity to see how it fits. You may create a fursona whose gender identity sort of represents kind of how you feel and just sort of play with it, try it out. So you go into furry spaces and furries are really good about sort of treating you and interacting with you as your fursona. So if I go up to people and you can see my fursona's name is Nuka on my badge, they go, oh, hello, Nuka. They won't say, hey, what is your actual human name? They'll be like, oh, hello, Nuka. They see my cat. They're like, oh, hey, another cat. Cats are great. And so if your, fursona is clearly presenting, with a lot of feminine traits, they'll use she, her pronouns. And it's a lot very common in furry spaces to also put your preferred pronouns. So and so for a lot of trans people, this is hugely euphoric. This might be one of the first experiences they have with being referred to with their preferred pronouns. And so for a lot of them, this is like dipping their toe into the water to kind of see, hey, is this something I'm comfortable with? And it's got this sort of playful fantasy environment. So it's very low stakes. If something goes wrong or it doesn't go well, it's not like hugely damaging to your self-esteem. It's like, okay, well, it's a silly little play space and I was just sort of trying stuff out. Yeah, so I think that for a lot of furries, they create and play around with their identity. The idea of species and other features becomes malleable in furry spaces. So like, hey, if I can be anything, why not be a cat? And no one's going to make fun of you, right? If you decide that your fursona is 40 feet tall and likes to stomp on buildings in the spare time, how am I going to make fun of you for that when my fursona is a neon blue cat?
That's awesome.
Yeah, so it's a really cool place to play with identity.
I think most people have seen like furries with fursuits, obviously. Is that like a requirement? What are the requirements? And also more information about the suits. How expensive do they get? Do you make them? What's the deal with the fursuits?
What's the deal with the fursuit? Well, and I think it's a good question. That's one of the first questions I get, because for a lot of people, they conflate being furry with a fursuit. And I can't blame them. Fursuits are the most visually iconic parts of being a furry. In the same way, if I asked you to close your eyes and picture a Star Wars fan, you're picturing a person in a Starfleet uniform. If I ask you to picture a Star Wars fan, you're picturing some goof waving around a lightsaber, right? Or wearing a stormtrooper outfit. So for furries, when you picture furry, you picture the fursuit, the full body mascot style suit. That's not a requirement to be a furry. There's no furry judge and jury deciding you are or are not a furry. In the same way that no one gets to decide if I'm a fan of the Detroit Red Wings or not. That's just sort of something that I am or are not. But it's one way that an interest can manifest, right? So in the same way that you wouldn't take an anime fan and say, well, you're not a real anime fan unless you've cosplayed. For some people, their favorite part of a show is looking at a costume and saying, I wonder if I could pull that off. I wonder if I can make that and go around dressed like that. Other people, they just want to watch the damn show. And that's kind of the same for furries, right? So for some furries, they say, boy, it would be really cool to be able to walk around in the world as my fursona. How cool would it be to be the cartoon character, right? To run around in the world and have people react to me like I was Bugs Bunny in the real world. And for some folks, that is really, really cool. For other folks, that is really hot. It's like wearing your sofa. Absolutely not. So to say that, oh, furries are people who wear fursuits would be like saying, oh, sports fans are people who paint their face in their team colors and buy $200 jerseys, right? For some folks, sure. For other folks, no. The data suggests that about 30 to 40% of furries may own a fursuit. So by definition, most furries do not own a fursuit. And one of the reasons being that it's really expensive and or time consuming to make one. And they say, well, why doesn't every single hockey fan own an autographed jersey from their favorite player? Because it's expensive and there aren't a lot of them. To make a fursuit takes dozens, hundreds of hours to make. And that's assuming that you know what you're doing in the first place. The material costs are expensive. Most furries don't make their own suits. There are people who make a very lucrative career building fursuits professionally for a living. There's a tremendous skill tree that you have to sort of climb to be good at doing this. So they spend years honing their craft. And so, yeah, a typical fursuit might run a person $3,000, $3,500 US, which is a lot for a hobby. I don't care how big of a hockey fan you are. You may not have $3,500 to drop on season tickets or on a trip to go see the Game 7 of the playoffs. So yeah, so for some folks, that's just not how their interest manifests. For those for whom it does manifest that way, yeah, the motivation for it is in many ways similar to the motivation to cosplay. Why does a science fiction fan dress up as their favorite character from a show? It's fun to do, right? Go to a convention and hang out with the other nerds. And it's really fun to show off, hey, look at all the work and time and money that went into mine. And you can sort of compare and contrast, or you can hang out with other people. Maybe you have this little sort of found family and, hey, all of us have suits that are made from the same creator. So we can pose for these awesome shots where it's a bunch of us and we're all from the same little fursuit family kind of thing. But for others, it's the interest in being able to be something different. If you ever, Halloween is a fun time for a lot of people. And I think it's because you get to put on a mask and be kind of wacky, right? As soon as you put on a mask and become somewhat anonymous, you can break some social rules and get away with it. As an example, I own a fursuit, that I'll sort of show off to sort of make points and stuff in my classes and stuff when I'm talking about this research. And I can tell you, I'm kind of a shy person in person. So when I'm walking around campus, I would never have the audacity to just like walk into another professor's classroom mid-lecture. But you put a fursuit on me and I'll walk into the class and just start batting at a laser pointer, or I started writing random things on the board because I'm in a costume, right? My face is covered, no one knows who you are. it disinhibits you. It makes you feel a little more playful. It's a little more goofy. Other furries will say that, hey, it allows me to be seen. For a lot of these folks, they say, hey, I'm kind of shy. I'm socially awkward. Maybe I'm kind of visually off-putting. So I'm like 6'2", a big kind of scary looking bald guy. Not a lot of people running up in the street to go give me a hug or a high five, right? But if I'm a big fuzzy cartoon character, suddenly feel like, oh, high five there, giant cat. That's awesome, right? So for a lot of furries, that's part of the appeal, is just people giving an entirely different reaction to seeing you. For neurodivergent furs, we'll say, hey, social interaction is really tough for me. I struggle with things like making eye contact, or sometimes I'm a little socially awkward and don't quite know what to say. So for some autistic furs, the fursuit is a really good way to sort of sand over some of those rough edges, right? So if you're not making eye contact, it's not readily apparent. Or things like a lot of fursuiters won't speak, right? They're afraid of like breaking the illusion, or like, my regular voice coming out of this cartoon character doesn't sound right. So they just don't speak. They pantomime or act in overly cartoony gestures. And again, if you're autistic and find it really difficult to kind of speak, this might be a really good excuse to just not talk. Oh, they don't talk, and people just sort of roll with it. So there's a lot of motivations for fursuiting, everything from the cosplay element of it to just enjoying the challenge of designing and engineering an increasingly elaborate fursuit. I've seen $20,000 fursuits with air conditioning units built in and lighting, and there's an entire species called protogens which have their entire face is like an LCD screen. They project their face onto an LCD screen and they can like interact with it, and it's sort of like very complex puppetry where you can like in real time dynamically change the facial expression. Or furries will play around with things like robotics and stuff and have ears that move or a tail that automatically wags autonomously. So for some folks, it's just the technology and the craft of it that appeals to them. And for other folks, it's like Halloween. It's a fun excuse to costume. It should be noted that fursuits are typically worn at special events. So again, treat it like your cosplay. An anime cosplayer doesn't like go to school wearing their really sweet Naruto cosplay, right? They save that for Halloween or for like anime convention. And furries are that way as well. The average fursuiter wears their fursuit maybe once a month. And it's not like they wear it around the house. They wear it for like parades or events or when they're around other furries. So if you see a fursuit and think, boy, how does that person like vacuum and do the dishes in that? They don't.
I can see that.
Although they're very useful if you want to shovel snow in 25 below. I have seen furries who will do that because it is like the warmest coat you've ever worn.
It's funny because when you mentioned going into like another professor's like lecture with a fursuit, it unlocked a memory in my brain of me being in college. And I think it really only happened when we had night classes. But there's maybe like a couple of classes and we know who it was, but I don't think anybody really gave it any thought. But I think like a couple of times this dude actually showed up in like a full costume and we were just like, you just have this? Like, I didn't think about it at the time. I don't think anybody really gave it much thought. It's like, we were like, you just wore this to class. Like, he wouldn't talk. He would just sit there, in it.
And you roll with it.
Now I'm thinking like maybe he had somewhere to go after class.
But that's another thing that furries find really funny about fursuits too, is people will roll with it. So if you've gone to all this effort to put on a fursuit, people will be like, rather than thinking that's the weirdo, they'll be like, did I miss a memo somewhere? Especially if there's more than one fursuit. If there's like 5 fursuits coming down the road, you're like, am I the weird one? Is there something that I missed? People just roll with it. It's remarkable how you'll be in a fursuit, you'll walk up to like just a random businessman and say high five, right? And they didn't know what to do. They'll be like, okay, high five. And it's kind of neat to see, like, one of my favorite memories was going to a furry convention that had been cross-booked with an insurance convention. It was in the same hotel. I just distinctly remember the bar in this hotel where mingling with one another are all these business people in suits and ties mingling with fursuiters. And like, these very stuffy business people, they were having a ball. They were getting selfies with them. And so then like to see this like playful side come out of them, right? All day it's business, business, business. And hey, I'm partying with a giant tiger. Why not?
Insurance conference seems to be like the most boring thing on this planet. So I think you did them a favor. You spiced it up.
Yeah.
Oh, probably.
I guess it also reminds me of like when you go to like an amusement park and, you have the people dressed up as characters and they usually don't talk. Or when I was a kid, they didn't speak. So yeah, I mean, you like waving the Bugs Bunny and Daffy Duck and you're hanging out with them a little bit.
And at some level, even adults at Disney World are fascinating because The adult knows that's a guy in a Mickey Mouse costume. And yet in that moment, you suspend disbelief. And that's the fun part about it, right? Like this is a fandom that's all about suspending disbelief. Furries do not believe that they are cartoon animals. When you put on a fursuit, you don't think, hey, in this moment, I have become cats. No, you know what this is. But it's fun to suspend it. Hey, just for a moment, what if you could? I mean, and that's why we consume media, right? The whole joy of science fiction is, yeah, I know that we can't travel faster than light, but what if we could? And I know that there aren't dragons and stuff, but it's kind of fun to watch a show where let's pretend for a moment that there were dragons and knights fought them. What would that be like? And so that's part of the appeal of it is what if?
My name is Aussie Cat. I'm a very active member of the Furry fandom. Basically, when it comes to fandom spaces, I try to be more in the background, but I have been leading some of the BIPOC panels, Black and Indigenous Person of Color panels at MFF, that is Midwest Fur Fest, one of the largest fur conventions in the country. I do that sometimes in person, online. I also hold space in there as well. Well, put simply, like a lot of furries, I walk straight through the giant door with the word Disney on it. As we know, when it comes to storytelling, animals are used a lot simply because, one, there are certain stereotypes and just like characteristics attached that make it very easy for people to, see themselves and see traits that they may or may not recognize in themselves. Disney has used that many, many times. It started with Lion King and it hasn't stopped since then. I think it was 11, almost 12. Yeah, I was already getting into anime, that sort of thing. I went online and I found people that were friendly, welcoming, and they could draw me like Kovu from The Lion King 2. And with that, I never looked back. I think you guys probably already know the word persona comes from, the word persona being a way that someone sees themselves, maybe the view, different characteristics that they want to emulate, or maybe they're trying to emulate throughout, their presentation. So my furry persona, I'm a cat. I have a few, but my main one is a domestic long hair. I'm a cat. I love furry. It is a hobby. I don't go to work in the suit, so it's mostly just for times when I have the opportunity to. I've definitely done some streams in suit. I'm not a big streamer, but the content that I do have tends to be furry adjacent, if not, furry centered. So I've done like things on how to groom your suit, so how to keep it clean, that kind of stuff. Obviously, fursuit necessary for that versus my other hobbies. Otherwise, I would not wear it on the daily or so much around the city, if only for the reason that each suit piece costs a minimum of $300. If we're looking at purely numbers, like most nerdy communities, it tends to be dominated by cis white males because, again, the gateway, I said in the beginning, is the Disney door, but also smaller doors are through anime and comic books. If you look at that community, despite what it may look like online, white guys, straight white guys, that's the vast majority. Little mission is to make sure that when people come in, they know that there are faces like theirs and they're not alone in it. Sometimes they can feel like they're the only one in the crowd. So just want to make sure people know that's not the case. The community is for everyone. So to get into persona creation, usually you start with what I want to be. Again, depending on when you enter the fandom, it tends to be, am I sly like a fox? Am I friendly like a dog? And I feel like once you get your species down, or species, depending on, you get an idea for the traits that you want to, show to the world, the traits maybe that you want to develop. And then from there, the name kind of comes, But species first. First of all, the creativity. If there's something that furries are, it is creative. If I had to do a sign up, I would just say, if you're curious about the furry fandom, come on in. We're a very welcoming place. Just know that there's a lot of variety. There is so much creativity. And honestly, we're waiting for you. Come through.
You have this interesting dynamic being a furry yourself and also studying it. So can you just tell us what your personal journey as a furry is? When did you find out that this is your fandom? These are your people?
I'm actually pretty unremarkable as far as furries go. I always kind of joke that I'm really boring. I grew up liking the standard fare of cartoons and stuff, and even as an adult, like BoJack Horseman, Tuca and Birdie, phenomenal show. Yeah, just shows that feature walking, talking animal characters. And so I would hang up art of these shows and stuff in my locker at school. And I always felt like kind of a weirdo. I'm like, like all my friends have kind of grown up, but like I still think these characters are kind of cool. I still think it's kind of neat to, I was watching anime at the time as well. So I had anime posters in there as well. And like all my friends were kind of like, get a more adult hobby. And I'm like, why? This is kind of fun. And when I was in college, I had a friend of mine who saw a background on my laptop was this furry background. I didn't know furry was a thing at the time. He said, oh, you're a furry. The hell is a furry? He's like, I'm one. Let me take you to a meetup. I'll show you some people that you might be interested in. And sure enough, I go to this meetup and I'm like, oh my God. Unbeknownst to me was this entire community of people who like similarly said, oh my God, yeah, I love that show, right? And they showed me their laptop and they had pictures and wallpapers. Like, oh my God, I know that artist. It was amazing to me to feel like I'd gone from being this lone weirdo to, oh, there are other folks who share this hobby of mine. I can imagine being like a model train enthusiast. You're 40 years old and you like playing with model trains and you think, God, I'm this lone weirdo who still plays with it. Then you discover in the city over, oh my God, there's a model train convention and there's going to be 10,000 model train fans, right? And I can go there and for the first time in my life, talk to other people about this passion of mine that I felt so weird about. That was kind of like the feeling there.
I feel personally called out about the model trains.
Model trains are cool. Those things are neat. They're way more artistry.
Are there any subgroups within the furry fandom or any adjacent communities?
Yeah, the furry fandom is not like this homogenous entity where every single person is a furry and it's this walled off community. Furries are nerds. And in fact, as you start to delve into fan groups and stuff, it's all nerds all the way down. It's nerds all the way to the bottom. And so there's so much conceptual overlap. But I mean, when you think about the idea, okay, so walking, talking animal characters, well, that starts to overlap with anime because anime has a whole bunch of, Nico characters, these cat girl characters, right? Well, okay, well, that's kind of at this interface between furry and anime. So 50% of furries are also anime fans. It also helps that a lot of the furry fandom's origins, like back in the 1970s and stuff, some of the original furries sort of became friends because they shared this interest in science fiction and anime. Baked into the crust of the furry fandom was also deep roots into science fiction. So like half of furries are also science fiction fans. So there's bleed over between that community as well. 15% of furries are My Little Pony fans. Because when you think about it, walking, talking pony characters are functionally furry characters. And so, there's all these little sub-communities with it, not divided on what you'd think. A lot of people, like if you didn't know anything about furry, I think a lot of people imagine if you go to a furry convention, all the dogs go to one room and all the cats go to one room and all the horses go to one room. And that's not what happens at all. It organizes more around these sub-communities. Like, oh, here's a panel for all of the people who are into fursuit building. Here's a panel for all the musicians. Here's a panel for all the artists. Here's a panel for all the VR users. Here's a panel for all the gamers. Gamer culture is a big part. About 70% of furries are gamers, board gamers and video gamers. So yeah, it's not this one single entity, but it's just this overlap of all these different communities kind of gathered in one place. They all happen to have this shared interest in furry, but I've had the experience of going to a furry convention and then a month later going to an anime convention and seeing a bunch of the same people that I saw at the furry convention, right? Or you'll go to a local board game night at a board game shop. Like, oh, hey, there's my anime friends and there's my Little Pony friends and there's my furry friends. So yeah, there's a lot of these different sort of subgroups within these communities. The more you delve into different fan communities, the more you realize how much bleeding over there is between these communities. And that's not just unique to this as well. You might get sports fans who like, hey, you hang out with your fellow hockey fans. And then in the summer, you realize, oh, we're all gearheads as well. We all build cars and stuff like that. So maybe in the summer, you go out, do a little improvised hot rod show with your buddies, right? Where you look at each other's cars, talk about engines and stuff. I don't know anything about cars and motors, but I presume that's what people who do these things talk about. So this is not unique to any one fan community, but there's a lot of this overlap the more you dig into it.
It seems like it's a very broad community. So I'm just curious about, are there more men or more women in the fandom? What are the demographics in terms of sexual orientation, age, or race? We definitely know you guys are not poor.
Sort of mixed, actually. So, fursuiters probably have at least some expendable income if they can afford a fursuit. Demographically, the fandom tends to be what you think of when you think of a lot of nerd fandom. So a lot of young people, college-age people, data suggests they're pretty nerdy. So they have a lot of not only nerdy hobbies, but like they tend to do pretty well in school. The vast majority of furries are either aspiring to be college students, or they are current college students, or they are recent graduates of college. A lot of the hard sciences, a lot of engineering, a lot of visual arts, graphics arts, a lot of IT. You tend to find it's predominantly male. It's like 60% cis men, but you also see a significant proportion of trans folks. About 15% of the fandom identifies as transgender, which is a number that is considerably higher than the general population. And in the same vein, you also find that this is one of the few places in North America where you'll find that being straight actually puts you in kind of a numerical minority, right? It's about 60 to 70% of furries identify as pansexual or bisexual or gay or lesbian. So it's a very sizable LGBTQ plus contingency within the furry fandom. It's a very queer space. Not necessarily like by design, like there's no rule that says this, of course, but again, kind of an offshoot of historical precedents. Early science fiction fandom was also very queer and very open to people from all walks of life. The original many of the founding members of the furry fandom and that sort of first furry convention and such were LGBTQ themselves. And so when you create a space that is very open and welcoming to queer folks from very early on, it becomes kind of a beacon or a safe haven for a lot of queer folks. And so it becomes this space where, hey, here's a place where you can hang out if you're queer. And again, I'm a blue cat. How am I going to make fun of you for being gay? So these norms of inclusivity that really drive it. It's a very young, very progressive group of folks as well. So politically, it tends to lean fairly progressive because it's got this very LGBTQ plus contingent to it. In terms of things like race, it's largely contingent upon race, ethnicity, contingent upon where you are in the country. If you're going to a furry convention down south, you'll see a lot more Latino furs and black furs. If you're going, up north, you'll see a higher proportion of whiter furs. Yeah, whatever you tend to see in a traditional sort of geek space is what the furry fandom tends to look like. Picture what a group of anime nerds might look like, or a group of board game nerds might look like, and that's probably what furries look like as well. To return all the way back to your earlier point about furries being rich, in the sense that a lot of them are college students, a lot of furries are very poor. They're living with their parents, they're paying off student debts, but because they're getting a college education, a lot of furries eventually in their late 20s going into their 30s, with that college job, they tend to land decent careers. And so it's largely a demographic thing, right? A lot of furries are younger, and if you're just focusing on them, they're going to look very poor. But if you sort of take the long picture, you see that a lot of them wind up in IT careers or science careers.
Yeah, I think I got a pretty good mental picture of just like a group of furries. What are some misconceptions about furry subcultures and fandom, and how do they come to be?
To understand the misconceptions, I'm going to take it back for a lesson in how the mind works. One of the ways we understand the world is through what are called prototypes, right? So when I say picture a car, you're probably picturing something with 4 wheels, maybe kind of sporty, maybe it's red in color, right? But you're picturing like the typical car in your head. And that's the car. That prototype is the car against which all other cars are compared, right? So if you see another car go by that's red with 4 wheels, you go, that's a typical car. That's a normal car. That needs no explanation. But if you see a limousine, a stretch limousine that, seats 40 people go by, you're like, what the hell is the deal with that car? That does not match my prototype. That is a weird car. Now there's an explanation. Now you're looking for what's the deal with that car, right? Or another example that helps people think, well, this is dogs. Picture a dog, and you're probably thinking like generic dog breed, like golden retriever or something, or a lab or something, like a generic dog. And the further exemplars of dogs stray from that prototype, the more it like demands an explanation, like Chihuahuas, what is your deal? Right? You are not a dog. You do not resemble my prototype of what a dog is supposed to be. So this is how we understand everything in the world, from chairs to people to objects. So we have a prototype for fan. When you say to the average person, picture a fan, not an oscillating fan that cools your room, but like a fan of something. And they're usually thinking music fan, television fan, that sort of thing, right? So a fan of a sports fan, right? So sport fan, music fan, fan of a particular TV series. So for most people, that is the typical fan. That is the acceptable range of what a fan should be. And as you stray further and further from that, There's okay, well, explain yourself. What's the deal? My typical fan is a football fan, a fan of the Green Bay Packers. That is the generic typical fan. So what is this furry thing, right? Why don't you like a normal thing? I've never heard of this. You're wearing the fuzzy animal costume. I don't get it. Explain yourself. So again, you wouldn't ask a Taylor Swift fan, explain yourself, right? Or a basketball fan, explain yourself. Even though it is on its surface patently absurd. How absurd that a bunch of grown men will beat each other up running down a field chasing an inflated pig bladder, right? This is the weirdest thing ever as an abstract concept, but it gets a pass because it's mainstream, because it's normal. So the things we're fans of are about as arbitrary as it gets. And yet for things that are mainstream and prototypical, they get a pass. But for furry, okay, we go looking for an explanation. And the more extreme or different the group is from the prototype, the more we feel like we need an extreme explanation for it. This can't just be a matter of aesthetic preference. It's too darn weird. So you look for other explanations, sufficiently weird explanations. And so for a lot of people, the two places they go when looking for a weird explanation is, oh, this has got to be a mental illness thing. Their dogs aren't all barking. Or this is a sex thing, right? Sex is weird for a lot of folks. This has got to be some weird sex thing, right? So they're doing it because there's something not all right in their head, or they're doing it because they're getting off to it somehow. So that's what a lot of people sort of default to. And I think that's where a lot of the lazy stereotypes kind of come in, right? So people see this, and so it becomes very easy, when that's what you assume, it becomes easy to just sort of believe anything people say about furries if it sounds sufficiently weird. So there's a litter box myth that was perpetuated for the last few years in common media, right? Oh, I heard from a friend of a friend who was at a furry convention working security that they use litter boxes, right? Is it true? No. No one has ever been able to track down this elusive litter box or this friend of a friend. No one has ever been able to do it. And yet it sounds sufficiently weird. It's weird enough that you go, furries, those are those weird people. Yeah, that tracks. That makes sense. So it's weird enough that people can believe it. It gives it some plausibility. So I think a lot of these misconceptions, oh, furries put on the suits because they want to get in touch with their inner animal. They are delusional, and they think when they put on the suit that they've transformed into a cat. Like, no, that's not what's happening. But it's believable to people who are looking for an explanation that goes beyond just, well, they just like this stuff. For a lot of people, that just doesn't parse. That doesn't seem like possible. And yet there's such a wide range of model trains. Some people just really like model trains. It's not a weird sex thing. It's not a mental dysfunction thing. If it's sufficiently weird, people will say things like, oh, well, are they autistic, or are they, do they have no friends? Like, why the model train? It's not enough it's weird enough that people go, what's the deal with the model trains? There has to be some kind of explanation. So I think that's where a lot of those misconceptions stem from.
I guess they feel like they don't know anybody who is in that particular fandom. So it's like it must be rare. Speaking of the things that you've heard people say about the fandom, what are some of the strangest things that you've heard about furries?
I mean, the litter box one has got to be up there. This is a story that's tinged with a really sad reality. So as best as we've been able to sort of track it down, there's a bunch of schools, a bunch of elementary schools and schools with young kids. And in some of the classrooms, there are litter boxes. This is true. This is a true thing. There are litter boxes in a lot of elementary school classrooms in the States. And so people, I think, saw this and said, what's the deal with the litter box? This is weird, and maybe you don't know off the top of your head why there's litter boxes there. And so someone looks at that and says, oh, I've heard of those furries. Oh, this must be more of that woke shit I've heard about. This is probably some furry student demanding to have a litter box because they won't use. Now, again, this has never happened. Never have we ever been able to track down a single instance of a furry in a school demanding to use a litter box. This is just not a thing. That's up there with, oh, this Star Wars fan is insisting that his teachers call him Master Kenobi. This does not happen. So I think that's where that came. What's the deal with the litter box? What's the actual deal? The real reason that there's litter boxes in a lot of these schools is because of mass shooting events, active shooter events, especially when there's a lot of little kids around. If the school has to go under lockdown for a prolonged period because of an active shooter event, if kids have to go to the bathroom, you can't let them go to the bathroom. And so that's the real reason why those litter boxes are there. That's a really horrifying piece of reality for people to comprehend, right? And so you can imagine why a conservative person might be kind of reluctant to acknowledge why those are there, there, it's so much easier to deflect and say, oh, it's those damn furries, those weirdo furries. And again, furries are weird enough, and most people don't know what a furry is. They point at, oh, well, that's believable. And it's a wonderful deflection of attention away from the really tragic reality of why those are actually there. Once you hear about it, you actually get really upset at like the audacity of that deflection.
Yeah, I had no idea that there were litter boxes in elementary schools. That's horrifying. That's completely insane. And it's just, avoiding the larger issue, but then, okay, well, I don't understand these people, so I'm just going to tack that onto them and then find another explanation as to why. And we do that with so many things.
And the current political climate, furries are a really easy scapegoat. In a time right now where politicians are kind of playing hide the ball, right? That, I'm going to do some insidious policies. Look over here. It's magicians in misdirection. Look over here, get outraged by this. Furries are the perfect clickbait, the perfect distraction. So you find some story about a kid who wanted to wear a tail to school. Furries are invading the schools and demanding that they be allowed to meow and bark in schools, which they're not. But it's outrage bait. So people start outraging and get stuck on this issue and then completely ignore the 50 other things that are happening while their back is turned. So furries are just time and time again this really convenient, very eye-catching scapegoat. All you got to do is put a couple of fursuits in your picture at the start of your news article, and boom, you got eyeballs on pages, baby.
I think the perfect word you said is insidious. And it's kind of like the sociology of a rumor, how it spreads.
What I would say to people is, I'm like, would you do this with any other group? Furries are just weird enough that you can get away with doing this. Imagine if I were to try to say this sort of thing about fans of Breaking Bad back when it was really popular. And just, oh, well, they found joints in a high school bathroom. It's that Breaking Bad fan base. I hear that these fans are all amateur meth cooks and they're all trying to push drugs in school. And this fan base is becoming corrupted. Like, it's ridiculous. Like, the lunacy of this is, but for whatever reason, furries are weird enough that people don't empathize with them and they'll believe whatever they're told about them.
That's kind of messed up. What do you think people outside of the fandom don't realize about what it truly means to be a furry?
I think one of the things that gets lost, that inability to empathize. I think as soon as you make that connection and realize, oh, I'm a fan of Lord of the Rings. And if I'm a fan of Lord of the Rings, I have way more in common with a furry than I might think, just in terms of having a piece of media that I'm a fan of, right? Like the underlying processes are so similar. I guess if there's one thing that I wish more people sort of knew, it was that furries are furries for the same reason that sports fans are sports fans and Harry Potter fans are fans of Harry Potter. It's the community. We live in an era where we're increasingly losing our connection to other people as more and more of society moves out to the suburbs and we build these fences and separate ourselves from other people. There's this craving for human connection. Robert Putnam wrote a book called Bowling Alone that puts it better than I ever could. He talks about this notion that, like, gone are the days of the bowling league, where a bunch of people after work would go and they would bowl together and shoot the shit, right? Or the corner pub where you and your friends would hang out after work, right? Or the PTA or the Kinsmen or the Elks or the Legion Hall. Like, all of these things are gradually fading and they've been replaced with nothing. So you have these people who are losing their sense of community. They're losing a sense of connection to the world around them. And people are craving this. I think it's one of the reasons people turn so much to social media. It's like the artificial sweetener of this. It's providing a substitute for what's been lost, right? And I'm not downplaying the communities you find here. They're absolutely communities. But it is a symptom of the fact that, yeah, we've seriously lost something. The fact that most people don't know and have never spoken to their next door neighbors. Very different world from like the 1950s. So I think for a lot of people, they don't have their work friends, their church friends, their friends from the recreational soccer. They don't have any of these things anymore, but their fan communities are providing those. And I think that a lot of people miss that. When they look at a fan group, it's easy to look at, oh, they like My Little Pony. What a ridiculous hobby. Oh, they like model trains. What a ridiculous hobby. Oh, they like furry. What a ridiculous hobby. It's easy to just sort of dismiss and trivialize it without realizing that, no, they're finding that community. They're satisfying that ingrained need we all have for community. Again, if you're lucky enough to have a church group or a group of work friends, cool. But for these folks, that's what it is. And these communities build resilience. One of the things we saw during the COVID pandemic, we did research on this. it was so devastating for so many people, not just because of the illness, obviously, but because of the isolation. We're a social species and we were forced to be isolated from other people. And we saw furries during that time were turning to other furries just as much as they were turning to their friendships. So yeah, maybe they go to a convention and watch their favorite show and goof around in fursuits together, but the bonds they're forming are genuine bonds that are providing resilience. When the chips are down and life is kicking you and it's really hard, this is the community they're turning to. If you need a couch to crash on for the night because your house burned down in Los Angeles, or if you need $500 to make rent, right? Or if you need a shoulder to cry on because you just got dumped. These are the people they're turning to. And so many other people, if this happened to them, they have no social support network and they're just kind of miserable and alone. So yeah, the fan interest is kind of the excuse to pull people together. It's the like, how do we get everyone in the same room? But once they're there, you realize very quickly that that was just kind of the excuse to get everyone into the room. What's really funny is if you go to like a furry meetup, like, hey, here's a furry house party, and you expect it to be a bunch of furs watching shows and stuff like that and fursuiting. Oftentimes, it's like people griping about their mortgage payments and people, how are the kids doing, right? And job sucks, right? You realize that very quickly. They're just like any other human beings. They're interacting and just talking about day-to-day stuff. So I think that's what a lot of people miss out on, is that this is about the community. Again, bowling leagues were never about bowling. It was an excuse to hang out with the guys, and you happen to be bowling while you're doing it.
My name is Zarafa Giraffe. I am 66 years old. I discovered the fandom about 14 years ago. I had no idea I was a furry until I discovered the community at a Burning Man party in San Francisco. Since I have found the community, it's been pretty much life-changing and now occupies 90% of my social life. And it's a pretty amazing group of people, and it's very creative. I've sort of found my tribe, if you will. It happened at a Burning Man party in San Francisco. If I had discovered this community before I ever went to Burning Man, I probably would have said, that's crazy, that's no way. And as time went on and I saw what other people at Burning Man wear, a lot of them wear furry or furred garments. And then I noticed, again, not that these were furries, but people were wearing hats with ears. And I thought, wow, those look really cool. I think I would like to wear hats with ears and be fuzzy and wear purple. And so I started doing all those things during those first 5 years, something I never would have considered before Burning Man. Like I said, it opened me up. And I knew burners are very friendly people, and I just went and started socializing. And I saw a guy in an amazing costume that looked like a saber-toothed tiger. And I went up to him and said, that's a really cool costume. Did you make it? And he went, oh God, no, I didn't make it. I had it made for me. I'm a furry. And I literally kind of went, what's a furry? As he's talking to me and describing characteristics of people who are furries, that they like animation, they like cartoons, they like being an animal, I was going, well, I do that. I have those. I'm that way. It was as if I had a bunch of jigsaw puzzle pieces in my head that I did not know were there. And in the course of 1 hour conversation, they fell down and formed a picture. And I literally went, oh my God, I think I'm a furry. I get goosebumps just thinking about it. And I walked out of that party a different guy than when I walked in. I didn't just immediately jump in. I was very embarrassed and shy by it. I didn't tell a lot of my friends at first. There was a writing group. I'm a writer, and I started going to that. And then I went to another group that was a movie night, and I was petrified. I'm 66. I have a head of gray hair, and I was thinking I was going to walk into this movie night, and everyone's going to go, who's that weird old guy? And 5 minutes inside, I was in a deep discussion about the movie director, Stanley Kubrick. And 4.5 hours later, I left like, wow, that was amazing. I had made instant friends. And then I was off and running. And it just slowly built from there. So my persona is a purple giraffe. Many people struggle with what to do as their persona, and for me it came relatively easily. Giraffe has always been my favorite animal. I worked with them when I volunteered at the Sacramento Zoo. My first day, my first hour was, you're going to clean the giraffe barn. And I was like, okay, while I'm shoveling and dumping and shoveling and dumping and sweeping, I felt what I thought was a fly in my hair, and I brushed it away. And the fly came back, and I got a little more irritated and brushed it away. And the fly came back a third time. I'm like, where the hell's this fly? And I looked, and it wasn't a fly. Brutus had leaned all the way over and was licking me. And when I turned, his head was 3 feet above me, and they're enormous. And his eye was about the size of a baseball and the color of melted chocolate. I just stared at him, and he stared at me for about 10 seconds, and he moved away. And I'm like, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God. That was one of the most amazing things that's ever had happened to me in my life. And I went home and told all my friends that I'd been kissed by a giraffe that day. And I vowed that I would have to have a career where I could work with amazing animals like that. And that's part of why I became a veterinarian, because of that experience. I like to say that I had a giraffe as a career counselor. Yes. I think I paid $2,000 for my first fursuit. And at the time, I remember saying it was the largest non-essential purchase I'd ever made in my life. When we wear fursuits, and there's a lot of variation on this, but in my normal everyday life, I don't even think about it. In fact, wearing this is somewhat unusual. I thought I'd add a little giraffe something while we're talking. I only get giraffed up when I'm at a furry event. And even then, not all furry events have fursuits. It's a lot of money. But when I think of the joy and the experiences I get out of it, I don't hesitate. I go to more conventions than most. I go to about 10 or 11 conventions a year. There's not a lot of people that do that many. But having said all that, I still go to work. I still pay bills. I don't do my shopping or go to restaurants in fursuits. I look like a normal person. I told my best friends, and they were immediately supportive.
You kind of touched upon this, but it seems like a lot of people assume that being a furry is just a hobby, but it seems to be more than that. So can you just tell us a little bit more?
To be sure, there are varying degrees. So there are a number of furries, I would say a lot of younger furries in particular, who are just getting their feet wet. It is just a hobby. And again, that's the same with other fans too, right? Some folks, like I watched Star Wars. I thought it was pretty neat. I might call myself a fan of Star Wars, but like I wouldn't call myself like a diehard. Like I don't have a $300 lightsaber. I don't go to Star Wars fan conventions. For me, I'm like, oh, I'm a fan. The movies were pretty good, and I leave it at that. And there was a bunch of furries for whom that's it. It is a casual hobby. They watch some shows. Maybe they've gone to a convention and bought some merch, and they leave it at that. But there's definitely a contingent of furs for whom this is a lot more than that. Again, you can watch a sports game just because you like the team, or you can watch the game because you and your friends have been going to the bar to watch the game for the last 20 years. And that's your boys' night out, right? Or that's your, or you and your dad used to watch this 40 years ago, and it's this connection you've had to your father for decades. So for some folks, it is deep and meaningful and significant. And the communities and the social support networks that are built through this are genuine and authentic and deeper than most people might expect. And that's one of the appeals of studying this, right? Is the fact that I sort of joke that I study the things that people trivialize, and I take way too seriously the things that most people make fun of. But I think there's a reason to do so. I think we're justified in taking a second look and saying, yeah, it looks silly, but there's a really deep and meaningful reason for some of these folks at least to be doing this. And again, for folks for whom it's a silly little hobby, that's cool too. Everyone needs a hobby.
Anytime I ask somebody, what do you know about furries? The first thing they say is it a kink? That's just where their mind goes immediately. And I just want to address it in a way where they understand, you've mentioned it, but I feel like,
is it a sex thing?
Is it a sex thing? Obviously you've answered that, but I think we should probably just go a little deeper into it.
Yeah, so I guess there's a few different approaches I can take to answering this. So one way to ask this is, so is there sex in furry? And the answer is yes. In the same way that there is sex in basically every human hobby. Maybe model trains might actually be the exception that proves the rule here. But humans are interested in sex. We are sexual beings, right? We are beings with a sexual instinct, and we have hobbies. And so it's very natural for people to merge their hobbies with their sex interests. We see this across hobbies. If you're a gearhead, if you love cars, go buy a car magazine and they put a supermodel across the hood of the car. Does it mean you've got a car fetish? No, it means you like cars and you have a sex drive. They go hand in hand. One of my favorite movies of all time, The Terminator, a classic in science fiction, right? There's a sex scene, a well-shot sex scene or lovemaking scene in the middle of this sci-fi classic. By putting that there, does that imply that, oh, I've got a robot fetish or some kind of science fiction fetish? No. People like killer robots, and hey, people have a sex drive. We see this with other hobbies, right? Go to a sports game, go to a Dallas Cowboy sports game. There's cheerleaders dancing around, right? And they're wearing skirts, and it's people combine their hobbies with sex. So is there furry themed pornography? Absolutely. Take a person, put cat ears in a tail. People like naked people, regardless of whether they got cat ears in a tail or not. Heck, the original Playboy bunnies, right? Hugh Hefner put bunny ears and little cotton tails on them, right? This is not even unique to the furry fandom. Yeah, so there's porn in the furry fandom. You can look it up if you feel so inclined. There's also porn in the Harry Potter fandom and porn in the anime fandom. What's interesting about furry is that for no other group do we use the existence of porn within that as a defining feature of that group. So imagine if you're a gamer. I'm a gamer. I say, cool. So gamers are people who play video games and masturbate to video game themed porn. And gamers be like, whoa, what was that last bit? No, I'm a gamer because I play game. And I go, aha. But I can go on Google and find Lara Croft themed porn, can I not? Therefore, video game fetish. We realize that's patently absurd, right? The existence of pornography with that theme does not mean that every person who has that hobby has a fetish for this. Otherwise, every person who likes anime would have an anime fetish. It is there, right? There is plenty of anime themed porn, but we don't do this. We don't say that an anime fan is a person with an anime fetish. According to our research, it would probably be correct to say that about 10% of furries, maybe 15% of furries, could probably be characterized as being primarily motivated by a fetish. So about 10 to 15%, it is primarily the porn. They are there for the porn. Ditto for a bunch of anime fans, they're there for the porn. They're not watching the shows. They're just there for the pinups and the porn, and then they log off. So about 10 to 15% of furs, that is, and there's nothing wrong with that, for the record. No kink shaming, no shade here. If that's what you're into, as long as no one's getting hurt, by all means. But it would be inaccurate, I think, to say that furries, like all furries, are motivated by it. And we have data that show that. When you ask furries, hey, is sex the reason you're here? They say, no, I'm here for the community. I'm here for the art. I'm here for the hobby. Do I look at the porn? Sure. It's there, right? If I'm going to look at porn, might as well look at porn in my favorite genre of media, right? Or featuring my favorite characters. But that's not why I'm here, right? If you were to take away the porn, there would still be a furry fandom. If it were a kink, that would not be the case, right? If this is all about kink, if you took away the porn, everyone would stand around being really disappointed and they'd go their separate ways. It's inaccurate, I think, to say that most furries are motivated by the sex. The porn is there, but that's not the driving force, right? That's not the bulk of the media. That's not what brings this community together. I think another reason people conflate this as well is because being a very LGBTQ plus community, the furry fandom is very progressive and sex positive. So furries will tell you about their kinks. If you ask a furry, hey, straight up, what are you into? They'll start listing it. Right? Oh, I'm into this, I'm into this, I'm into this. They're not shy about it because it's a place where you just kind of talk about these things openly. People hear that and think, oh, therefore furries must be especially kinky. That's not true. So we've actually done a really, really cool study where we compared anime fans and My Little Pony fans and furries. And we said straight up, hypothetically, if I were to do a survey about sex and ask you questions about your kinks, how honest would you be with me on a scale of 1 to 7? And the bronies and the anime fans straight up said, you know what? I'd lie to you about some stuff. There's some stuff I just wouldn't tell you. And furries were like, yeah, what do you want to know? My life's an open book. The difference was like a 4 out of 7 versus like a 6.5 out of 7. Furries are an open book. So when you see things like, oh, furries have these kinks and some furries are into BDSM and whatnot, right? You say, oh, furries are really kinky. No, furries will just tell you about it. People are kinky. The average person has some whips and chains in their closet they're not telling you about. It's just that furries will be open and tell you about it. So I think that combination of being very open and willing to talk about it, and again, furries being sufficiently weird that people don't give them the benefit of the doubt, or they will assume the most egregious things, leads, I think, a lot of people to think, oh, it's a kink and furries are into really wild stuff. And the data just don't suggest that that's an accurate characterization of the fandom.
What would you say to people who are interested in getting into the fandom, but they don't know where to start? Where could they start?
About 10 years ago, I would have said find a local furry forum, because I think 49 out of the 50 states had a local furry forum, like a place where you could go on. Forums aren't as big a thing anymore. They kind of gone by the wayside. There are Telegram groups, there are Discord groups where furries hang out. So looking, type in your city name or type in your state name and Discord, furry Discord, this state, and you may find something there. Furry conventions are a really good way to get your feet wet as well. Most places now, most states, typically within driving distance of at least one annual furry convention. I'd say within, typically, no matter where you are in the States, unless maybe Alaska, you're probably within a couple 100 miles of an annual furry convention happening somewhere. So that might be a kind of a good way to check it out. Just kind of go for the weekend and just figure out what this is about. If you're in a city, there might be a local furry group or furry club that's worth checking out. Maybe they do weekly meetings or monthly meetings. And again, they're not what you think they are, right? When I used to do local meetups once a week, we would go to a restaurant. Pick a different restaurant and we'd all go there, and we didn't wear any of our furry stuff or whatever, right? You may well have sat at a table next to a group of furries and just had no idea, because we would do that. The 10 of us would go and we would just sit down and have a steak at a restaurant and just talk about whatever, right? But we all happen to be furries. So yeah, there's local meetups and groups like that. Social media, there's a lot of communities in social media where furries sort of hang out. So I know there's a big TikTok community, there's a big YouTube community with furries in it. There's lots of places. Online is usually the best spot to start looking, though.
What would you say to parents who have kids that have expressed interest in the fandom?
So there's actually a wonderful group called Moms of Furries. So if you find yourself in this situation, there's a wonderful group called Moms of Furries. They're a terrific resource for parents who are discovering that their kids are furries or their kids have come forward to them about this. I guess a couple pieces of advice I would give. The first is treat this like you would treat any other hobby. If your kid said, hey, mom, dad, I'm a Marvel fan, right? Oh my gosh, we failed as parents. Where did we go wrong, right? Like, no, it's a hobby. It's a hobby like any other hobby. So treat it with that gravitas. Keep in mind as well that this may be indication of a lot of other stuff as well. So a significant chunk of the furry fandom is LGBTQ+. Not all, of course, but if your kid says, hey, I'm hanging out with furries and I'm kind of part of this furry space, there's a decent chance that maybe they're also LGBTQ+. And so this might be kind of a way of testing the waters. A lot of furries will say that they describe the process of coming out as furry as very similar to their process of coming out as gay or coming out as trans. Just because your kid says that they're a furry, don't assume they're gay or they're trans, right? They just be a fan of BoJack Horseman. Just be mindful, be open-minded. Often we say if your kid is telling you this, like if they come forward and tell you about this, that's usually a good sign. It means they trust you. It means you're doing something right as a parent. If you're kicking in their door and turning over their bed and stuff to try to find evidence that they're into this furry thing, right? That might not be a good sign. Maybe there's some other issues to be had there. But also just engage with their hobbies, right? In the same way that if they said, hey, I'm into model trains, cool. Maybe we go get you a model train. Maybe I sit down with you and you show me why this is interesting to you. I'm just kind of curious. Like, take an interest in your kids' hobbies. A lot of parents will come to furry conventions. You can come to them. Come along with your kid and they'll, let them see what it's like. If you have concerns about this, and see it for yourself. Come to a convention with them and see the panels they go to, see the fursuits, see what this thing is all about. Make an informed decision for yourself. Don't base it on what you saw on a news report. Go check it out. If your kid is into this, they're getting something out of this. This is something near and dear to their heart. And if you brush it off or push them away or try to, make them feel bad for it, that can potentially be really alienating. That your kid's going to be pretty hurt that they're sharing with you that this is this thing that's important to them, and you're just going, piss off, that, stop liking that thing. And this is a potential opportunity to create a sort of touch point, a common interest that you have. And you may not be interested in yourself, but just sort of showing them you're supportive of them can go a long way to building really good rapport with your kid. Examples abound of furries who say, look, I tried to, my parents found out about this and it didn't go well. And they kicked me out of the house. And that's a kid who's got an estranged relationship with their parents. That's a family that's got some probably deeper rifts going on too, beyond just the furry thing. the best thing you can do, check it out for yourself. Go to a convention or go to a meetup with them and just see it, right? Check out the vibes. If something seems kind of awkward about it or kind of uncomfortable about it, then sure, go with your gut. But I think most parents who go to a convention will be like, yeah, this is just a bunch of nerds and dorks being nerds and dorks.
That's awesome. And yeah, hopefully there are a lot more parents that become super supportive and involved, and it'll help the kids feel accepted and better about themselves, especially with self-esteem and all that kind of good stuff.
If I had like a final message, it would be wear that weirdness though, like embrace it, right? Everyone's got some weird interest. Knitting, right? You're really obsessed with knitting. Embrace that shit. Like don't hide it or be embarrassed about it. Just lean into it.
But yeah, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us.
Thank you so much.
It's been a delight. It's a pleasure to, especially with people who are asking the right questions and clearly coming into this with the right attitude. So I appreciate that.
We'd like to give a huge thank you to Dr. Courtney Plante for sharing his expertise, and to Aussie Cat and Giraffe for opening up about their personal furry journeys. The furry fandom is so much more than the stereotypes suggest. If this episode made you think differently or sparked your curiosity, let us know.
Well, that's going to do it for this episode of Bound by the Cloak. We will have a bunch of resources, videos, photos, just an insane amount of things about furries listed on our website under the show notes. And as always, you can find us on social media. We are on X, Threads, TikTok, and Instagram. And you can find us wherever you get your podcasts, whether that be Apple Podcasts, Spotify, CastBox, Good Pods, Podcast Addict. You can find us anywhere. And obviously, you can also listen on our website as well. We'll be back again in 2 weeks with a brand new episode. Thanks for listening.
Until next time.